The $10 million lie, the audacious swindle that fooled a nation.
The glittering dust of San Francisco. The summer of 1872 in San Francisco was thick with the dust of new money and the sharper scent of ambition. The Central Pacific had stitched the continent together, the Comstock lode was still coughing up silver, and every man with a shiny suit and a confident handshake believed he was one telegram away from becoming a Vanderbilt. It was a time when men invested not in facts, but in fervor. This fever had a name, and that name was Philip Arnold. Arnold and his partner John Slack were, by all accounts, unremarkable men. They were distant, laconic cousins from Kentucky who looked less like titans of finance and more like tired prospectors, which, in truth, they were. They frequented the rougher saloons of the Barbary Coast, avoiding the opulent marble halls of Montgomery Street, where the city's true wealth congregated. They dressed in worn broadcloth, smelled faintly of coal smoke and saddle leather, and they said very little. But for the past 6 weeks, what they carried had spoken volumes. It began with a single massive emerald, roughly cut, the size of a pigeon's egg. Arnold, feigning ignorance, had shown it to an appraiser named George Roberts. Roberts, a man whose professional skepticism was usually as thick as a San Francisco fog, was stunned into silence. He confirmed the stone's authenticity and brilliance, but Arnold merely chuckled, retrieved the gem, and vanished. The next sighting was at the Bank of California, the monolithic power center of West Coast finance, controlled by the Silver Kings like William Ralston. Arnold and Slack didn't want a loan. They wanted to deposit a few pounds of raw, uncut diamonds. When Ralston himself was summoned to the vault, he found a canvas sack resting on the heavy steel table. Arnold opened it. Inside, glittering under the gaslight like a handful of wet gravel, were thousands of rough gems, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and more emeralds. "Where did you find these?" Ralston asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the display. This was not a miner's strike. This was geological impossibility. Arnold chewed on a toothpick, his eyes giving nothing away. "Up country, a secret spot. We just want to hold 'em safe, Mr. Ralston. We got no use for city folk digging around in our business yet." Ralston, a man used to controlling markets, suddenly felt an unfamiliar tremor of excitement and fear. The greatest diamond field in the world was thought to be in South Africa, not the barren alkali flats of the American interior. If this was real, it would dwarf the Comstock, collapse the world's diamond trade, and make San Francisco the undisputed financial capital of the planet. Within days, the fever had spread from San Francisco across the continent via the new telegraph lines. The financiers of New York and London began to circle. Charles Louis Tiffany, the man who built the Tiffany & Co. empire, examined a selection of the stones and declared them genuine, valuing the parcel at well over $150,000, a fortune then. Even the Rothschild family of London was rumored to have been contacted. The biggest names in American finance queued up: Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor, General George S. Dodge, the railroad baron, and a cadre of powerful European investors. The result was the formation of the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, capitalized at the unheard-of sum of $10 million. Arnold and Slack, the two Kentucky cousins who hadn't owned a decent pair of boots 6 months prior, demanded and received $600,000 in cash and stock in exchange for the title to their secret claims. The investors were given 2 conditions for the sale: They could not tell anyone the exact location of the field, and they must send a recognized expert to verify the site's authenticity, without armed guards and without revealing the location to the public until after the deal was closed. The skeptic in the Sierra. While San Francisco danced on a carpet of imagined riches, 300 miles east in the high, unforgiving peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the only man who could genuinely expose the hoax was charting the landscape. Clarence King was, at 29, already a legend. He was a geologist, a Yale graduate, and the youngest director of a federal survey in American history. He led the geological exploration of the 40th parallel, a massive, complex, and dangerous undertaking to map the land along the route of the new transcontinental railroad, spanning from eastern California to Wyoming. King was not merely an academic, he was an adventurer. He had scaled Mount Tyndall, been shot at by bandits, and had debunked popular gold rushes by simply studying the rock formations. He was witty, meticulous, and, above all, an unwavering disciple of scientific reality. When the frantic telegrams from Ralston's syndicate finally found King's camp, his initial reaction was cold contempt. "Diamonds found near the 40th parallel. Need immediate expert verification. Company formed. Extreme secrecy. Your fee unlimited. Return immediately." "Diamonds," he scoffed to his assistant, James Gardner, pointing a finger at a map covered in pencil notations for granite and shift. "Diamonds are found in ancient kimberlite pipes, volcanic breccia that has survived immense erosion. There is no known geology in the North American interior, save maybe in the deep south, that suggests such formation. It is a fairy tale for those who believe in fairy dust." But the insistence was too great, the names involved too powerful. Ralston, he knew, was no fool. If Tiffany and Greeley were in, something was truly afoot. And if it was a fraud, King's duty to science and to his country's financial stability demanded he expose it. He left Gardner to continue the high-altitude surveys, promising to be back in weeks. He took a single, battered canvas sample bag, his rock hammer, a spyglass, and a profound sense of geologic skepticism. The journey to nowhere. Arnold and Slack, having already secured their initial $500,000, were eager to complete the ruse. They needed to take an official expert to the site, let him be impressed, and get his binding word of certification. They settled on a respected German mining engineer named Henry Janin. Janin, a man whose expertise was genuine, made the journey first. He was led blindfolded and by circuitous routes over several days, riding hard from the railhead at Rawlins, Wyoming, into a vast, nameless plateau. When the blindfold came off, Janin found himself in a desolate, arid landscape of rock and low scrub brush. The site, as presented by Arnold and Slack, was a dry, rocky stream bed. The two prospectors immediately set to work, dramatically uncovering small pouches of stones hidden among the sand and under boulders. They instructed Janin to dig anywhere he liked. Janin dug. He sifted. And everywhere he went, he found them. Rubies, tiny clear diamonds, sapphires, glinting, blue and red and white. They seemed to be literally growing out of the ground. Janin, a man who had worked the mines of Europe, was convinced. The sheer quantity, the diversity, and the rough natural embedding of the stones felt overwhelming. His report, rushed back to the financiers, was euphoric. He estimated the field to hold deposits worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The $10 million company was instantly, on paper, worth $100 million. The deal was finalized, the investors celebrated, and the world was prepared for a shockwave. The quiet man arrives. Clarence King, however, had not stopped his investigation just because an engineer had signed off.
King knew that Janine was a mining expert, not a geologist. He understood the how of extraction, but not the why of formation. King arrived in San Francisco shortly after the deal closed. The city was mad. Stock prices were soaring based on rumors, and speculators were already buying up land around any remote rail depot, hoping to guess the location. King met with Ralston and the other investors. He listened politely to their tales of fantastic finds, but his questions were focused and uncomfortable. Did the diamonds show signs of alluvial wear, General Dodge? Were they rounded by river travel? Were the rubies found in association with chromium-rich rock, as the geology demands, Mr. Tiffany? The investors, who had only been shown polished samples and the excited report, had no answers. King's skepticism hardened into suspicion. He knew two critical facts. The true location, though protected by guards, was somewhere on the vast plateau where the corners of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming met. The diamonds, if real, would exist in a unique and specific geologic formation, a very rare blue ground that pointed to the deepest levels of Earth's mantle. King quickly found a weak link, a disgruntled low-level courier who had driven supplies to the guarded site. Under polite but firm questioning and an offer enough cash to start a small business, the courier cracked. He described the last few miles of the journey, the distinctive Three Butte Hill, and the nearby alkali spring. King and Gardner, who had rejoined him, immediately secured fresh horses and provisions, telling the investors they were heading back to their survey along the 40th parallel, a lie of convenience. Their actual target was a remote, anonymous patch of dry ground somewhere near the headwaters of the Green River. The needle and the haystack. King and Gardner rode hard for 4 days across the plains of Wyoming, relying on King's meticulous topographic maps and the courier's rough visual landmarks. The landscape was brutal. Endless sagebrush, high winds, and the oppressive silence of the plateau. Finally, they located the distinct Triple Peak landmark. Following the courier's directions, they descended into a valley and found it. A small fenced-off clearing, guarded by 2 bored-looking men armed with Winchester rifles. King and Gardner, dressed in their dusty, neutral survey uniforms, simply rode past the guards, claiming they were following the 40th parallel line, an authority no one in the West dared to question. The guards, satisfied that 2 grubby, educated men with surveying chains posed no threat to a $10 million mine, waved them through. King dismounted in the supposed diamond field. It was desolate, sun-baked, and profoundly geologically wrong. "Gardner," King murmured, pulling out his rock hammer, his voice hushed with the dawning horror of realization. "There is not a single sign of the required deep volcanic activity. The parent rock is a simple sandstone, a sedimentary layer. Diamonds cannot form here. They have not been here for 1 billion years." They spent the next hour working scientifically. King scraped away the soil, studying the embedded stones. He noted the precise chemical structure of the accompanying rock. He chipped away a small seam of the reddish, diamond-bearing soil. Then Gardner noticed something strange. Beneath a boulder where a ruby had been exposed, the soil seemed unusually loose. He knelt and began sifting the earth with his fingers. "Clarence," he called softly, "look at this." King walked over. Gardner held up a tiny, glittering ruby, perfectly shaped. It was embedded in the earth, but the surrounding soil had been subtly disturbed. King took the ruby and rubbed it between his fingers. "Too uniform," King declared, his voice hard. "Too many flawless stones of the same hue. And the placement. Look at the dust here. It's freshly disturbed, not by wind or erosion, but by man." King's gaze fell on a small, isolated ant mound near a large cluster of embedded diamonds. He retrieved a small trowel and dug gently around the mound. He pulled up a cluster of dirt and handed it to Gardner, who immediately gasped. "Phosphor," Gardner whispered, identifying the tiny specks of white material mixed with the sand and tiny pieces of glass. King stood up, his face grim, but with a strange, cold excitement. He had the answer, and it was far more audacious than he had imagined. They didn't find a diamond mine, they planted one. King confirmed the shocking truth. Arnold and Slack had brought bags of cheap, uncut stones, low-grade rubies, sapphires, and industrial diamonds, purchased in London and Antwerp for pennies on the dollar. Then they had pulverized the gemstones, mixed them with dirt, and literally salted the earth. To make the deception convincing, they had used a common prospector's trick, burying a small cache of loose stones in ant mounds or rodent holes, knowing that the animal's natural activity would bring the stones to the surface, making it look as if they were spontaneously rising from the ground. King collected his samples, a handful of the diamond-bearing dirt, a selection of the cheapest, most poorly formed rubies, and several samples of the surrounding sandstone. King said, "The jig is up. Let the guards keep watching their empty hole. We have an investor meeting to attend."
The bomb in the boardroom. 3 days later, Clarence King stood before the assembled investors in the marble-clad San Francisco boardroom. The atmosphere was celebratory. The men were discussing the construction of a private railroad spur to the mine, and the naming of the new towns that would spring up around the unprecedented wealth. King waited for the chatter to die down, his gaze steady and unforgiving. "Gentlemen," King began, placing his battered canvas bag on the massive mahogany table, "I have returned from my geological survey of the claims purchased by this company." A hush fell over the room. General Dodge smiled warmly. Ralston leaned forward, expecting the final triumphant certification. "The news is disappointing, gentlemen. The field is not only worthless, but it is a complete, unmitigated fabrication. You have purchased nothing but a pile of salted dirt." The room erupted. Cheers of disbelief mingled with shouts of outrage. "Mr. King, Janin certified it," Ralston roared, his face turning crimson. "Mr. Janin is a mining engineer, Mr. Ralston," King countered, holding up the tiny, flawed ruby he had plucked from the ground. "These stones are real, yes, but they are planted. They were imported from the South African alluvial fields and the gem markets of Amsterdam. They are of low quality. They lack the specific crystal characteristics of an in situ deposit, and most importantly, they are embedded in tertiary sandstone, a rock that cannot, geologically, host primary diamonds." He scattered the dirt samples on the table, showing the subtle traces of foreign minerals and the telltale signs of recent disturbance. This was a deliberate, calculated hoax, a brilliant one, to be sure, using your own greed and secrecy against you. The field was salted to make it look like a treasure. Gentlemen, you have invested $10 million in a lie. The resulting panic was instantaneous and total. The news spread like a prairie fire. The stock market reeled, and the financial careers of many men in that room collapsed in minutes. The great financial fraud of the West was over, detonated by a single sharp-witted geologist and a piece of sandstone. Arnold and Slack, having sold their shares and collected their $600,000, were already gone, vanishing into the Wild West with a small fortune. Clarence King became a national hero.
the man who saved the reputations of America's most powerful investors and defended the honor of scientific truth against the lure of easy money. But the saga of the great diamond hoax was not yet over. The search for Arnold and Slack and the hunt for the money was only just beginning.
The audacity of the retreat. The moment Clarence King dropped his bombshell, Arnold and Slack were already hundreds of miles away, beyond the reach of the initial civil suits and the Telegraph's rapid judgment. While San Francisco burned with scandal and humiliation, the two cousins were riding the Transcontinental Railroad, not as rough prospectors, but as successful businessmen traveling first class, their canvas sacks replaced by polished leather satchels containing the equivalent of roughly $15 million today. Their escape was meticulously planned, timed to coincide with the very day King was due to report. They did not disappear into the mountains or try to establish a remote hideout. Instead, they returned to their roots, choosing the quiet, respectable anonymity of Elizabethtown, Kentucky. This move, turning a fortune based on fraud into the foundation of apparent legitimacy, was the final, most audacious element of Philip Arnold's scheme. John Slack, the quieter partner, settled into comfortable retirement, fading into the gentle rhythm of rural life. But Philip Arnold, the true mastermind, could not simply sit on his money. He craved the respectability that wealth conferred, a respectability he had only been able to fake in San Francisco. He bought property, invested heavily, and, most surprisingly, became a pillar of the community. Within a year, Arnold was helping to found a local bank, the Deposit Bank of Kentucky, and using his ill-gotten gains to dispense loans and purchase influence. The man who had almost single-handedly brought down a global diamond market was now a respectable, clean-shaven banker and a candidate for the state legislature. It was the ultimate Wild West twist, achieving success not by finding a mine, but by successfully deceiving those who believed they controlled the mining industry. Back in San Francisco, the investors of the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, now the laughingstock of global finance, faced a painful choice. They could pursue Arnold and Slack through an endless, costly legal battle across state lines, a process that would require them to publicly detail every moment of their gullibility. Or they could attempt to recover their losses quietly. Ralston and the other powerful men chose the latter. They sent word to Arnold through intermediaries, demanding the return of the funds. Arnold, astonishingly, did not scoff. He realized that holding the entire amount made him a permanent target, whereas repaying a substantial portion while keeping a huge profit would buy him peace and, critically, protect his new image as a legitimate man. A deal was struck in 1873. Philip Arnold returned approximately $350,000 to the investors, claiming the rest was used up in purchasing the rough stones and maintaining the field. In exchange, the syndicate dropped all legal action against him and Slack, effectively granting them amnesty. The investors, having recouped just over half their cash outlay, salvaged what little dignity they could, and the great diamond hoax was officially closed as a legal matter. The ultimate fate of Philip Arnold, the man who bamboozled America's elite, was as dramatic and sudden as the rest of his life. Settled into his comfortable life as a respected banker, he became embroiled in a mundane, local land dispute with a former business associate.
In a shocking, anticlimactic end to a legendary fraudster, Arnold was shot and killed in 1878 on the steps of the Elizabethtown courthouse, not over diamonds, but over a simple, small-town squabble. John Slack, the silent partner, lived out his days peacefully, dying of pneumonia in 1996, having never spent a single day in prison for what remains one of the greatest swindles in American history. The tale stands as a testament to the power of greed, the brilliance of audacious deception, and the quiet triumph of scientific truth in the raw, chaotic landscape of the American West.
The unwitting legacy. The exposure of the Great Diamond hoax in late 1872 was not merely a financial blip, it was a profound cultural moment that redefined the American perception of the West and sharply divided the country between the old spirit of speculation and the emerging authority of science. The immediate fallout focused on the humiliation of the victims. William C. Ralston, the driving force of San Francisco's Bank of California and the most prominent victim, never fully recovered from the mockery. He was globally ridiculed, not for losing money, but for being duped by two Kentucky cousins he considered far beneath him. The scandal subtly eroded the invincible aura of the Bank of California, contributing to the financial instability that would lead to its infamous collapse and Ralston's mysterious death 3 years later. But the most significant long-term consequence was the elevation of one man, Clarence King. King's dramatic entrance into the boardroom, his calm, authoritative declaration of geological impossibility, and his presentation of evidence stood in stark contrast to the greed and secrecy that had defined the investors. In an era where the public was weary of railroad corruption and speculative bubbles, King, the young Yale-educated geologist, became a genuine national hero, a symbol that knowledge and truth could prevail against the darkest forces of fraud. The hoax effectively served as a massive public marketing campaign for the value of federally funded science. King's successful debunking proved to the United States Congress that geological surveys were not just dusty academic exercises, but critical tools for economic stability and national defense against fraud. This event directly paved the way for King's most important achievement, the consolidation of rival government surveys into a single cohesive entity. In 1879, Congress established the United States Geological Survey, USGS, and King, at the age of 37, was appointed its first director. The hoax, therefore, did not just save a few fortunes, it created the foundation of modern American geoscience. The Wild West itself also suffered a legacy of skepticism. For decades, the frontier had been marketed as a boundless resource, a place where any man could strike it rich. The diamond hoax proved that the region could also be a terrain of pure deception, where the very soil was a willing co-conspirator in a lie. Prospectors and mining companies operating legitimately in the following years found themselves facing an unprecedented level of scrutiny and cynicism from Eastern and European capital. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the entire affair was the simple mechanism of the fraud. Arnold and Slack did not need complex banking systems or high-level insider trading. They relied on the universal human traits of secrecy and avarice. They knew that if the stones were real, the investors would be too desperate to check the geology, too fearful of competition to call in independent experts, and too convinced of their own shrewdness to believe they could be fooled by a pair of rough-hewn Kentuckians.
In the end, Philip Arnold's great achievement was not the millions he temporarily stole, but the simple fact that he used the very elements of the American dream: secrecy, swift profit, and the promise of a vast, untapped frontier to orchestrate a perfect and perfectly legal retirement. The diamond field remains a barren, high desert plot of land in Wyoming, a silent monument to the power of a lie and the quiet heroism of the man who used science to unmask it.
The tally of shame. While Arnold and Slack settled comfortably back into the East, the consequences of their dazzling deception continued to ripple, not just through San Francisco's finance, but into the very lives of the men they fleeced. The hoax became more than a scandal. It was an infection that killed confidence, and in some cases, men. The most tragic figure in the aftermath was undoubtedly William C. Ralston. He had been the engine of San Francisco, a powerful, charismatic man whose ambition had built the Bank of California into the West's most dominant financial institution. However, his private exposure to risk, including the immense loss on the diamond field, weakened his foundation. In 1875, just 3 years after King's announcement, a financial panic swept the city, and the Bank of California, damaged by its reputation and Ralston's overextended investments, failed spectacularly. Ralston, stripped of his power and his honor, took a morning swim in the San Francisco Bay, a ritual he enjoyed daily. He never returned. The verdict was heart failure, but the public, and many of his contemporaries, believed the true cause was a broken spirit. The man drowned by the weight of his own financial hubris, a humiliation that began with a handful of cheap African gems. Henry Yanin, the mining engineer whose expert word had sealed the deal, suffered a terrible, if temporary, loss of professional standing. The public outcry was directed as much at his gullibility as at the con artist's malice. Yet King's defense of Yanin, insisting the error was one of geology, not integrity, eventually allowed him to recover. Yanin went on to have a respected career, but for years, any time a speculator sought his opinion, they would inevitably remind him, with a smirk, of the great diamond hoax. The field itself became a strange, unwanted monument. The federal government never bothered to formally claim the worthless land, and the investors abandoned their claim instantly. For a time, it was an odd sort of pilgrimage site for journalists and curious travelers, all looking for the place where so many millions had vanished into the sagebrush. Today, the actual location, a remote high desert plateau where Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah meet, is virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the vast empty landscape. It is simply a patch of forgotten, rugged Americana, a piece of land that once glittered with the promise of the world's wealth and then returned to being just dirt, quietly proving Clarence King right forever. The legend of the Great Diamond Hoax survived because it perfectly captured the paradox of the Wild West. It was a land of infinite opportunity, but also a limitless space for deception. It was a story where the educated elite were undone by the cunning of two backwater cousins, and where the hero was not a gunfighter or a gold panner, but a young skeptical scientist with a rock hammer. The greatest fortune ever uncovered in the American West turned out to be the one Arnold and Slack kept in their pockets, built on the sheer, glittering audacity of a lie. The glittering cautionary tale. The final chapter of the Great Diamond Hoax was written not on the dusty plains of Wyoming, but in the archives of history and the pages of cautionary business literature. What Arnold and Slack accomplished was not just a successful crime, but a masterclass in psychological manipulation that relied entirely on the blindness of greed. They understood that the powerful men of finance wanted to believe in the limitless instant wealth of the American frontier so badly that they would disregard all logical and scientific evidence.
The hoax became a turning point, not only for American geology, solidifying the necessity of unbiased, professional assessment, but for the American financial landscape. It served as a permanent, painful lesson that sensationalism and secrecy were the hallmarks of fraud, and that the promise of easy riches often concealed the most elaborate traps. From 1872 onward, due in large part to the humiliation of Ralston and Tiffany, American investors approached any new Western discovery, no matter how convincing, with a far greater degree of healthy skepticism. The scattered diamonds and rubies, originally purchased for less than $20,000, ultimately cost the investors millions, but the price to American capitalism was a permanent loss of innocence. The saga remains the quintessential American cautionary tale, a story of how science saved the nation from financial disaster, and how two clever Kentuckians proved that in the scramble for wealth, the fastest way to get rich is often not to find a diamond mine, but simply to convince others that you have.